Hey everybody, welcome to the Westphalia Faith Podcast. My name is Austin Fox. I'm joined today by my co-host, Bryce Thelen. This is the first episode of a podcast where we'll be discussing the Catholic faith in Westphalia and why it means so much to us. One of the main goals of this podcast is to talk about why our Catholic faith means so much to us and to hopefully grow in our relationship with God and strengthen that faith. We hope that it'll have the same impact on everybody listening in and around the Westphalia area. This is a project that we've been talking about for quite a while, but we never got around to actually doing it, so it feels good to finally get the ball rolling on this and get this thing going. With all that being said, Bryce, my man, how are we doing this evening?
We're doing well, Austin. Excited to be here, pretty fired up to finally get this project underway and just start informing other people about the faith and as the coronavirus comes to an end, why we think everyone should really start coming back to the faith as we're able to start going to church here pretty soon.
We're going to be discussing an interesting topic that's surrounding the Catholic faith right now on this debut segment. It has to do with the dispensation that the Catholic Church had issued over the past year. Catholics were allowed to not attend weekly Mass if they so chose, again, over the past year, but that dispensation has come to an end, and it's a requirement, once again, for Catholics to return to Mass on a weekly basis. Obviously, I think there are a lot of people who are not returning, and that's disappointing. Westphalia is fortunate in that most families are devout Catholics, and that I'm sure they are returning, but I guess one of the main topics that we'll be discussing is, and Bryce, I would love to hear your opinion on this, on why you think it's so important for people to return to Mass once again on a weekly basis now that this dispensation is over.
Yeah, I think humans, we're creatures of habit, and I think that's the important thing is everybody before was going to Mass because that's what you did. All the way growing up, you went to Mass because it's what you did every weekend. Your family went together, your parents took you, told you to go, and we had a year off it due, unfortunately, to the coronavirus pandemic, and now that you didn't go to Mass for a year, that habit was broken, and it's starting over now, and it's like, well, what are you going to do? The ball's in your court. It takes a while to get back into the routine again. You used to be able to wake up, watch Mass whenever you wanted online, and it is a little bit more of a hassle to go in person, and I guess, why we're here is to tell you why that hassle is worth it. Why should you take that hour and a half out of your weekend to go to Mass? Why should you give Christ that time? And, I think it's the faith, like anything, is you're going to get in what you get out of it. And when you just see people who are so on fire and see people, in the church and cut that time out, you're so rewarded by that because God's looking for that relationship, and the Mass is one of those gifts that God gave us where you truly get to be as close to Him as possible here on earth. And I just think it's something that you can't get to the same extent being behind a television screen.
Jordan Spitzley wrote an outstanding article on the front page of the May 16th Bulletin, and a lot of what he wrote really resonated with me. I'm going to read a short paragraph from it because, again, it's an outstanding line, and I think it's one that I hope everybody in Westphalia saw. He wrote that, "We certainly don't go to Mass out of convenience, but instead we purposely inconvenience ourselves as a sign of God's importance in our lives. We give God our day, our week, and our lives just as Jesus gave His life on the cross for us. So no matter where we lie on the spectrum of thoughts about returning to Mass, let's turn them back to the Lord and what He did for us." And again, that line really resonated with me. God has done so much for us, and I think a lot of people take it for granted. So many people, especially in Westphalia, are in outstanding shapes financially. From a job perspective, they have great homes, great families, and I think once you step outside of Westphalia, you realize that that's not the case everywhere. Both you and I, Bryce, have lived outside of Westphalia, and I think we've realized how non-existent the Catholic faith is, unfortunately, amongst a lot of the people that we've gotten to know. Just speaking personally, I attended Eastern Michigan University from 2013 to 2016, and I saw a little bit of everything in the people I met. The Catholic faith was, again, non-existent, and some of the people I lived with atheists, where God and religion were not a part of their daily lives at all, and it quickly made me realize that that's not the kind of lifestyle that I want to live or the kind of path that I want to follow. I'm assuming, obviously, you're going to MSU right now, Bryce. Is it fair to say that you've come across certain aspects like that where the Catholic faith is not relevant at all with some of the people you've met?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely had a little different experience than you, being a little closer to home, and as well, this was my first year where I had the coronavirus pandemic, so meeting people is a little more limited, but still, you move away, and when you go to church functions, you go to adoration, you go to masses, you just see, the demographic is so much older. I mean, you just don't see as many young people, and when you go out and you do meet the new people, on weekends or whatever the case may be, it's just a lot of people who they won't even bring up the faith, and they just refuse to talk about it. They declare, God doesn't exist, as you said. It's a lot of people who not only do they not take their faith serious, but they will just completely disown the idea of God existing, which is really, really upsetting that someone could fall that far away.
I'm glad you brought up the demographic in churches outside of Westphalia, because for a while when I lived in Ann Arbor, I attended St. Francis of Assisi Parish, and that's actually the parish that Father James Conlon preaches at, the former Westphalia priest, and I noticed this right away. When I would go to weekly Mass out there, the demographic was older people in their 70s and up, and then families with very, very young kids, and there was no in-between. There were no people, or very few, in their 20s and 30s, and even 40s, and it was very disappointing to see. Again, fortunately, we don't have that in Westphalia. When you go to Mass on a weekly basis in Westphalia, there are people of all ages, obviously, from birth, infants, to people in their 70s and 80s, and probably even 90s. So, again, we're fortunate in that regard. Personally, I love going to weekly Mass. That hasn't always been the case, but I learned to get a lot more out of it, and I'm incredibly thankful that I have. I had an extremely interesting conversation with a relative on Memorial Day of 2020, and it was right when the virus was kicking off, and not a whole lot was going on, and again, people were at home and had a lot of time on their hands. Excuse me. And one of the primary things that this relative said, if he had this much time on his hands on a regular basis, was that he would go to Mass every single day of the week, because you need that structure in your life. And that really jumped out at me. Bryce, you and I have talked about this off air. I know that we take advantage of Westphalia weekday Masses. I started going on Friday mornings this past Lent, Wednesday nights, and again, we're fortunate in that regard that many people go, and that we do have that opportunity to go to Mass, not only on weekends, but weekdays as well.
Yeah, for sure. I was lucky to stay at home, and every Friday morning, my first couple years of college, it was just routine. I'd go to Mass with my mom in the morning, and this is one of those things that you just realize how beautiful the Mass is. The more you go, the more you learn to appreciate it. And I think, it's just kind of like anything else. The more you do it, the more you present yourself there, the more you just see things you didn't before, and you just become more, engulfed in it. And it just becomes more of a blessing for you. It's not a chore anymore. And I think that's a switch when flipped, you just realize, the benefits that come of taking Mass seriously, going and getting yourself involved. I think you're sitting in Mass, and then there's actually participating in the Mass, and those are two very different things. And the more you go and you see other people and you just start really participating and not just being present at the Mass, it just becomes so much more valuable.
I think that's a really interesting way. The way you just worded it is that it used to be a chore or a weekly obligation, and for me personally, that's certainly not the case anymore. I'll be honest, I look forward to it every single weekend. There's nothing like kicking your Sunday morning off with a nice outdoor Mass. This past summer and the summer before in Westphalia, we had outdoor Masses, and we were just discussing this beforehand, but I think we both enjoyed those, how cool it was to celebrate the Mass outside. The 10 Commandments, number 1 and 3, really resonate with me in that the first commandment is, you shall not have strange gods before me, and number 3 is, keep holy the Sabbath. And I think those two commandments go hand in hand, again, with why we should attend weekly Mass. Jesus has done so much for us, and going to Mass 1 hour a week is the least that we can do in return. And it's a shame that some people don't see it that way, but it's why we're here. It's why we were born. It's why we're on earth. I've talked to a lot of non-religious people, and kind of ask them what their long-term goals are if they're not involved in the faith. And I think a lot of them look at money or fame or material goods as some of the things that they strive for. But you know what? When we die, all those things go away, and we don't have those at death. When you die, it's about how you lived your life, how you treated people, and again, how you served God. And that's why attending weekly Mass and showing God that you're invested in your Catholic faith and that it means a lot to you is one of, if not the single most important things that you can do during your time here on earth.
Yeah, I think, Austin, I think you just said that absolutely perfect there. Is you just talk to people, and there's just so many people are just so unhappy in their lives right now. And it's just, you just start talking to them, and it's, what are you pursuing? Are you pursuing something that is, it's going to end? I mean, everything on this earth has an expiration date, and God is the one thing that is outside of time. He is eternal, and it's something that, will you ever be completely satisfied here? No, and that's because you weren't created for earth. You were created for another world, and it's a desire that only God can satisfy. And I think when you hear people talk about money, fame, a job, like, when they pursue that, yes, it's good to have those desires and expect a lot out of yourself. But if you're not pursuing that for the glory of God and putting that first, I mean, you're chasing something that's going to end. You're just moving the target. The target's consistently moving away, and you're never going to find that true happiness until you look at, you go back to the basics and see the one that started and created it all.
I'm going to make a comparison here, and it might not be a very good one, but you know what? I'm going to make it anyway. There's a scene in the movie Moneyball with Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill where it's near the beginning. Brad Pitt plays Billy Beane, the GM of the Oakland A's, and he goes to the Oakland A's owner, Stephen Schott, and he says that he needs more money in order to compete with some of the big market teams in baseball, the Yankees and Red Sox, if the A's truly want to contend for a championship. And the owner, Stephen Schott, says in reply, he says, we're not going to hand out that money, and we're not going to spend that money, and we're not going to compete for championships. And then Billy Beane, out of sheer frustration, says, then what are we doing here? What's the point of all this? If we're not trying to win and compete for a championship, then again, what is the point of all this? And that's kind of how I look at life. What is the point of all this if you don't have an end goal in mind? If your goal is not to serve God, then what are we doing here? Again, we were born to serve God and to someday get to heaven. I know that some people think when they die that that's it. It's game over. But I obviously don't think that's the case. Catholics don't think that's the case. The goal is to get to heaven and to serve God in the best way that you know how to do possible. This is going way back in time, but in medieval Europe, people attended Mass on a weekly basis, and the Catholic faith is basically everything that their lives revolved around. If bad things happened, they thought it was because God was mad at them or punishing them, and vice versa. If good things happened, they thought it was because God was pleased with them, and it's obviously that's a bit extreme, but at the same time, it's disappointing that the Catholic faith nowadays is not as important or as prevalent as it once was 500-600 years ago in Europe.
Yeah, you just think of all the times and stories you've heard. I mean, even some that are present day when people are sacrificing their lives. You have priests who are celebrating like hidden masses with the chance of losing their lives, and people are attending these masses knowing their life is at stake, and what they're all giving up to truly pursue God, just attend a mass. I mean, and what are we not attending for? Just, my bed's comfy today. I could use an extra hour of sleep. And they're risking their life for this. And it's just, comparing apples to oranges here, but it's quite a difference. And it's really sad to look at what we're all willing to give up for God compared to some other people who, I mean, quite frankly, have been dealt quite a lesser hand than we have been. And I just think it should be eye-opening, and I think we should really reevaluate ourselves and say, what are we living for? What's my purpose? Why am I here?
Again, it's 1 hour a week, and it's the least we can do in return for God when considering everything that He's done for us. On that note, I think it's a good way to wrap up this podcast. Bryce, is there anything that you want to add here before we sign off?
I just say thank you guys for listening and tuning in. We really appreciate it. I know Austin and I are really excited to fire off this podcast, and hopefully we can continue to influence you guys and continue to bring you our experiences with Christ and help bring you closer, as it's obviously been a big part of our lives. So thank you for listening, and hope to see you again soon.
Again, if you enjoyed our podcast, feel free to give us a follow on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is at Westphalia's Faith Podcast. Again, that's at Westphalia's Faith Podcast. Thanks for everybody who tuned in. God bless you all, and we'll talk to you all again in the near future.